Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session all around tracing progress, looking at our 2024 insights into palm and soy supply chains. We're really happy to have you here to run through some of this with you. We've got attendees from companies throughout the supply chain joining us, including NGOs, service providers, certification bodies, and academia as well. It should be a really, really interesting discussion with lots of different perspectives involved. So really would encourage you all to get involved. My name is Becky Hamp. I'm one of the principal consultants at 3Keel. I'm going to be starting us off and also managing the Q&A as well. So today we're here representing 3Keel, who's one of the UK's leading management consultants. We do work across lots of different areas as 3Keel, as you can see on the screen. However, today is focused on the work that we do within the commodities supply chains area, specifically looking at sourcing of deforestation risk commodities. We do a lot of work around, for example, sustainable sourcing strategies, looking at end-to-end support in sustainable and regenerative sourcing for food supply chain businesses, also areas on measurement and reporting solutions, areas around landscape transformation, looking to really drive landscape management change and support resilient landscapes. And we do that as well through our Landscape Enterprise Networks program as well, that is a system that 3Keel has developed. As we kind of move through, we've been, obviously with these ideas and issues, they're very interconnecting across lots of the different areas we work in. For example, we've been increasingly working with the carbon team within the business and partners such as Ad Astra, looking at linking the commodities data that we have with land use change insights, for example. So joining us today, we have a couple of colleagues who are very, very well established in this area with decades worth of experience to talk through this with you. Unfortunately, our colleague Sean Allen is unwell and unable to join us today. So my colleague Ella instead will be stepping into the breach to run through a lot of the stuff with you around what it is that we'll be talking through around the kind of insights we've seen from 2024. We're also joined by my colleague Vor Schreiber as well, who's one of the founding directors and has been the program director of this kind of collective data program. So we're really happy to have them with us today to run through this in a lot of detail because they have a lot of knowledge and insight in what's been going on. I'll then be chairing the Q&A session that we have at the end. So just to give a bit of a view of the agenda for today, so we'll be going through introducing the reporting process itself before we then dive into the results, findings and recommendations themselves. In terms of the Q&A, so we do encourage people to please ask questions throughout. There is a Q&A box that you should see on your screen that you can click into and ask your questions in there. We'll have around about 15 minutes for the Q&A at the end. All of the questions that you ask will be put to the panel anonymously as well. So please do feel free to ask whatever questions you wish within there at all. We'll try and cover as many of those as possible during the session. If we're not able to address your question during the session, we'll try and get back to you after the session if you've left your details. Just to say that if you would like your organisation to be specifically attributed to a questions that you're asking, please make that clear within the question itself so that I can make sure that I do that when I'm asking the question to the panelists. Just a note to say, we can't speak on behalf of our clients. So please don't ask us any questions that are directed at a specific client or that involve any sort of commercially confidential information or sensitive data that we're not able to share, because we won't be able to share that with you. Also, just to note as well, we'll be sending out a webinar recording after this so that you can share it with your colleagues or whoever you wish to as well. So don't feel the need to note everything down as we go. You'll be able to recap at a later point. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Will to get us started with some of the context and background.
Great, thanks Becky, and good to see everybody today. And it's nice to see such a cross-section of both the suppliers and the supply chains that we're working with, our clients, as well as broader civil society and government policymakers who are interested in seeing what's happening with soy and palm. So before we launch into some of the kind of key findings and results from this year, we wanted to just explain some of the wider efforts that have been taking place over a number of years and kind of how we got to the point where we can see the data as it stands today. Now, in terms of the kind of specific results, we're going to be representing 18 different companies that have contributed their supply chains through this assessment, which means that over 1,600 companies were reached out to by us in the first quarter of the year for everybody's favorite time of year to do commodity reporting. And this spans not just a single market. We cover supply chains throughout the world, reaching from Australia through North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and of course the UK too as being included. And overall, the amount of material that we are involved in assessing for essentially traceability and deforestation and conversion-free verification status extends to 84,000 tons of palm oil and to about 2.3 million tons of soy. So those volumes do not represent a substantial view. In Europe, there's about 30 million tons of soy each year that's consumed by the livestock sector. We're less than 10% of that in terms of what we're verifying here. But what's unique is that we are able to have as much traceability as is possible back to the farming landscape, which affects, in this instance of soy, about 1.2 million hectares of land, and for palm oil, about 25,000 hectares of land. The significant difference between the two of those has to do with yield, and soy being quite an expansive crop, whereas you get a lot of oil. Palm oil is the most efficient vegetable oil per hectare of land of all vegetable crops. So the stats and the information that we'll be showing is around the visibility of that end of the supply chain. So what do brands, manufacturers, retailers have for visibility? How much evidence do they have? And how can they ensure that they're delivering upon their commitments to deliver deforestation and conversion-free supply chains? This process has been undertaken by 3Keel for the last 8 years. We have seen significant changes over that period. We're only going to be focusing on a few years in what we're sharing today, simply because of the comparability components, and also that there was a market shift in the approaches that were deployed by businesses after 2020. 2020 was a period where there was a previous kind of milestone for commitments, and 2025 is the next milestone. So a lot of what we're talking about today is very close to what we'll be seeing in a few months. And we really wanted to be able to share what's been working, where there are gaps, and where folks should be prioritizing efforts with the remaining time between now and 2025. Over the 8 years that we've been doing this, it expanded quite a lot from working with a small number of retailers within the UK, 5 originally just on palm oil, to quickly being expanded into addressing soy and cocoa. We've looked at various expansions of our program, such as introducing a formal platform. That 2020 commitment milestone started to change the way that companies were engaging and expecting evidence to flow through the value chain. 2022 was a year quite significant for the soy sector in particular, because that's when the national soy manifestos began to launch, whether it was in France or the UK or in Denmark in in the Netherlands in 2023, where retailers were aligned in trying to deliver verified deforestation and conversion-free supply chains by the end of 2025. In 2023, with the adoption of EUDR, that was the next starting gun for a sea change in how evidence and information was being used, because we were moving from a voluntary commitment to one that was now going to be active due diligence. And as we've approached through 2024 and the results that you're seeing today, those 18 companies are spanning a breadth of the downstream part of the food system and somewhat non-food as well, where there's multi-channel retailers and with broad portfolios. And these are the kind of key elements that are coming out today that we'll be highlighting. This information we use quite broadly. We publish the report every year. We do these types of webinars to be able to share the information and particularly the insights. Of course, none of the specific data identifying individual companies or their supply chains within that's down to individual companies to disclose themselves. However, we are a unique program, and we're one of the few that actually has this visibility across markets to say what's happening within the market. So not what do the academic views of trade flows say is occurring, but particularly when you're looking at how companies are supporting deforestation action in producing nations, being able to tie back to those nations, areas within them, or to engage suppliers on investing in things like certification. Those flows are an additional layer of transparency that's not generally in the public domain. So what we try to balance with these public reports and with these webinars is being able to show how those flows enable more directed action towards addressing problems, but it also provides us with unique statistics in the world to be able to inform policymakers and demonstrate where action is occurring. So we've shared results from this at the European platform meeting discussing EUDR. We regularly do briefings with various producing nations and demonstrate where investment is occurring and how it's occurring and what mechanisms are being used to try to address those gaps. We do respond to consultations as well, such as from the government in terms of what thresholds might be in place for the legislation the secondary legislation to implement the Environment Act, which was previously called the Forest Risk Commodities kind of proposal, and what the current government does with that, as well as informing civil society and sharing kind of those results where we can say this particular initiative is working or isn't working on the ground, and understanding what those barriers are. So if you're a supplier and you've been contributing to that process, we listen to you, we hear you, and we make sure that your customers, but also others that are affecting the policies and the things that are ultimately reaching your organizations, can respond to the real challenges that you're facing on the ground in really affecting this agenda, and making sure that we are all playing our part in delivering a more sustainable future that is free from deforestation and conversion in core commodity production. So with that bit of just context in terms of where the results are, I'll hand over to Ella now, who's going to take us through the specifics and what you've come to learn about.
Great, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so we'll begin to dive into the results now by summarising what we've seen going on within the market. So we've got very good coverage within the UK, and in particular the UK retail market, but we can also start to identify kind of global patterns beyond that. So today we'll be focusing on palm and soy, and including some element of comparison between the two, but more of a focus on soy due to its complexity. So there have been many developments kind of across the time, both within how we conduct our assessment as well as the macro environment, including the geopolitics and how that impacts the progress that we see. So as we'll mention, the alignment of retailer and hospitality ambitions and approaches has enabled a faster transformation of deforestation and conversion-free supply chains, but there is still more to do. So we've developed a specific definition of verified deforestation conversion free, so that's vDCF, with a range of options for soy, reflecting the complex mixture of solutions that might be used to reach those targets for soy specifically. So if we look at the last 5 years on that graph there, you can see real progress within both commodities, but there is still a long way to go to reach the 100%, which does pose an issue for many of the 2025 deadlines that have been set by companies, and especially those within the UK Soy Manifesto. So overall, the palm sector is by far outperforming the soy, as it typically does have kind of a simpler supply chain, a strong focus on RSPO segregated material and certification that has been sustained for a number of years now. And this maturity approach in palm is actually reflected in the conversations with suppliers and the quality of submissions that we receive off the back of that. So I guess just one note on this slide is that there is a wide range of percentages that we do see between the clients, and with retail generally outperforming non-retail companies. And then if we break it down year by year, we can see that the growth has been steady, and there has been a slight dip in progress for soy during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there has been a few milestone years which we've identified within those graphs here. So in 2021, the UK Soy Manifesto launch created momentum behind 2025 deforestation target dates for companies within the UK across the supply chain. And then within palm, in 2020, that was the year that the UK retail businesses adopted commitments, as Will mentioned, for RSPO segregated material at a minimum within supply chain. And then if we do look specifically within the UK, the launch of the UK Soy Manifesto has brought a number of companies together behind a shared goal for shipments, for all shipments of soy into the UK to be DCF by the end of 2025. And since then, volumes of soy reported to us for the UK market have remained roughly the same, but the difference is that the volume in vDCF material has increased almost tenfold, and a significant amount of volumes have moved from not verified, so that's that red bit within those graphs, to in transition, which is a combination of mass balance and regional claims that we see that come through the supply chain. So it's notable that there are a majority of soy vDCF volumes that within a few key livestock types: poultry, pork, eggs, and seafood. And you can see that on the graph there in green. But not all companies are unified behind this commitment, and the majority of volumes in the not verified or in transition bucket are not covered by a supplier vDCF commitment. So this means that signatory companies will continue to have to make significant progress to close the gap to reach verified deforestation conversion free by their 2025 target date. So clients are taking action as well as suppliers, and we're seeing that across the supply chain. So increasingly seeing investments in credits and the responsible commodities facility to meet these commitments with an impact that can now be quantified in tonnes. So this leaves actually a very small proportion of volumes entering the markets included in our reporting that is covered by no action at all. And the Responsible Commodities Facility has presented a new way for downstream companies to invest in sustainable production and provide a financial incentive for producers for not growing on land that's been deforested. And so each year we ask for information on the trader, the importer, and the region of origin of the materials that have been reported on. There hasn't been a clear pattern of increasing transparency across the board, which you can see on those two graphs on the screen. So within palm oil on the left, we're in our second year of asking for disclosure of country of origin, and this has risen in the last year as suppliers do have more access now to this information. However, in the past 5 years, transparency to trader has actually decreased over this time, which you can see on that line. And then if we look at soy, we can see a difference in transparency between retail companies who have been asking for this information for a number of years in our process and manufacturing and hospitality industries who have just joined the process more recently, but have already shown improved transparency in the last 2 years. So there's no clear momentum within either commodity here for full visibility of trader or region of origin by 2025, which makes the achievement of those deforestation conversion free goals and compliance for upcoming legislation increasingly more challenging. And so this year we partnered with Ad Astra, as Becky mentioned, to offer an additional add-on which breaks down land use change emissions associated with these commodities that we're discussing today. So the Ad Astra Orbay tool uses satellite imagery to identify where land conversion is occurring and calculate greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and conversion so that an emissions factor can be calculated at plot level to aggregate up to a subnational region and then a country level. So this has the ability to reflect deforestation conversion-free strategies and the certification used to build plans for reducing those land use change emissions. So this year we shared this aggregated data set with Ad Astra, and that's enabled them to build a picture of the average company's land use change emissions profile based on the country of sourcing origin that we collate. It also contains information on how soy or palm certification can be used to reduce that land use change emissions over time. And this chart here shows the reductions of over 50% in 5 years with a transition to physically certified soy from Brazil. We would encourage you to get in touch if you're interested in learning more about this specific topic, and we have got a webinar that's been recorded that we delivered a couple of weeks ago on this topic specifically. And I think Becky's just shared that within the chat for you all. Great, and now I'll just move on to the key findings, and we're just going to share a number of those that have pulled from a combination of data, observations, and team conversations with suppliers over the last reporting round. So for each commodity, progress does differ hugely based on the product type, which is often not reflected in the top level statistics that you see that are kind of publicized. So this graph shows the 3 best performing product types and the 3 worst performing types. You can see the top 3 and the bottom 3. So palm oil is on this graph, and food products are where we see the majority of our volumes lie within palm reporting, and generally perform very highly in terms of their verified and deforestation conversion-free percentage, which is why they're green. And this is typically because the ingredients that are used within food products are, such as palm oil itself, are readily available to source as RSPO, segregated or identity preserved. Whereas for non-food products, which is where you can see the health, cleaning products and cosmetics, they're very complex derivatives that are embedded within the ingredients, and they're not always available to source as segregated or identity preserved. So what we're consistently seeing here is addressing availability of derivatives is key to reaching 100% within the palm oil sector. And now we're looking at the equivalent for soy. So again, the top 3 are the highest performing and the bottom are the lowest. So for soy, it's quite a mixed picture. There's lots of different sectors and livestock types that kind of feed into this picture that we're seeing here. So with direct soy at the top there, we see a higher incidence of certification that's associated with that specifically, but also a lot of direct soy is produced in low-risk countries such as Europe, as it's GMO. And then within seafood, so that's looking at farmed fish specifically, because of their feed. So within that industry, we've got a cross-industry alignment with traders who are on board to supply 100% vDCF material and are establishing monitoring verification systems, which has enabled a much higher transparency within that supply chain. And then within poultry, there's some control over the feed within that system. So progress has been made, but action typically is based on customer request and with a large proportion not covered by a company commitment. So then dairy, beef and lamb are all independent supply chains, and that's what they have in common. So they're often aggregators purchasing from thousands of different farmers. So challenging the control of the content of the feed and specifically the verified and deforestation conversion-free status of the soy within that feed is very challenging. And some of these companies are working really hard to try and address this and should be supported. So at 3Keel, we're looking at working specifically with clients to develop new evidence requirements for these supply chains, which are perhaps more achievable for them. And then I guess just a reminder that some of that red and yellow block that you see there on the slide may well be produced without deforestation or conversion, but this just isn't visible downstream within the supply chain. Okay, and then this slide's looking at how consolidated supply chains are, which means that actually there's a very small number of companies that can move the needle quite significantly in terms of progress. So the level of consolidation is almost perfectly equal across palm and soy. with 5 suppliers making up 60% of an individual company's footprint. So they are the key suppliers to engage with on the vDCF goals to deliver. So at a UK level, it's also highly consolidated. So we see around 10 suppliers that contribute to over half of the volumes for each commodity of a company's footprint. So for each supplier, especially within soy, it's common to have multiple different certification or verification levels used. And these will often be based on customer requirements, with vDCF provided where it's been requested, and sometimes not certifying volumes where it's not explicitly outlined in the policy that they're delivering to. An example of this is soy oil in feed, where a soy meal policy exists. So what we're recommending is that all companies ensure clear and consistent expectations for a transition to 100% vDCF, working especially with the largest suppliers. So we also ask for evidence to support these company claims on vDCF when going through audit processes, etc., with specific requirements depending on the verification approach used. So, for example, showing correct volume, company names, correct year of issue. So around 50% of the claims for vDCF or in transition material aren't supported by any satisfactory evidence, which can present a problem when it's going through the supply chain. So a large part of this issue stems from the number of actors' evidence that needs to flow through because of the complexity of supply chains and that reaching the end customer to then go to the retailer or hospitality business that we're working with. And we do also see that where different standards are being applied by suppliers, it can become quite tricky to ensure that claims can be passed through the supply chain and that evidence is flowing with it as well. So transitional mechanisms such as regional credits seem to be much easier to provide evidence for. So we see that being widely used within our collection, and sometimes are used to cover volumes that are claimed to be vDCF, but actually don't have the supporting evidence to validate that claim. So in short, what we're really saying is that closing the evidence gap is going to be really important as we approach 2025. So as I mentioned, some sectors, such as independent producers, face particular challenges in collecting this evidence that's asked for. So we can consider adapting requirements be different for those purchasing independent producers compared to those purchasing soy or feed directly, and providing additional guidance here based on what's likely. So low risk origin is predominantly vDCF mechanism right now. It's used a lot, but nearly half of those low risk origin claims that we see coming through aren't currently supported by any evidence to validate them. And also, even where there is a clear mechanism for transferring credit claims within the RTRS system, this does not always happen with upstream transactions and not being able to always declare those further downstream to claim on behalf of their business. And now if we look at the method for how we calculate the footprints, it does depend on the level of knowledge that a supplier has. So if a supplier is able to provide information directly to calculate the volume of the commodity that's used within their products, we use this data primarily. And then if that's not the case, we apply a conversion factor, which simply is just tons of commodity per tons of product produced. And we select this from our best available data. So different conversion factors are used in different situations to reflect different livestock rearing systems, such as if we're thinking about animals being grass-fed for half the year, or different regions as well. So for palm oil, because of the direct nature of the ingredient, most suppliers know exactly how much palm oil is within the product. but 44% of soy volumes we calculate with a conversion factor currently. And now there's sometimes a perception that a conversion factor can be quite an accurate depiction of a footprint, but the reality is that the amount of soy or palm can differ considerably used on the product supplier, with many taking efforts to reduce the usage of the soy and palm. So focus now should be on engaging livestock producers for an accurate factor and linking this information through the supply chain for better quality data. So some suppliers in the beef and dairy sector have cited national statistics from UK and Germany to state portions of their supply, which are likely to be vDCF, and therefore claims were made to us that such volumes should be counted within their own footprints. So within the AIC Q1 2023 statistics, which are quoted here, we've turned them into annual estimates showing 65% of soy entering the UK as verified deforestation conversion free. But what we know, however, is that the vast majority of those vDCF volumes enter supply chains like poultry, pork, and eggs. So even with the overall statistic, even if it was consistent within the market picture overall, it might not be consistent within specific sectors that we've just talked about. So regardless of how that import picture changes, it is critical to ensure that the payments for ecosystem services in what Brazil are now referring to as the bioeconomy continue to provide the recognition for the role that landowners have in protecting vital ecosystems. The path to eradicating deforestation and conversion does not stop because an individual supply chain can prove its particular products have been cleared. And I'll pass back on to Will to go through the recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Ella, for taking us through all the statistics and findings from this year. So as we've been doing this for a number of years, we clearly have some opinions around where we think the sector should be going and what recommendations we have for different types of readers and those interested in this type of work in trying to address deforestation. So first and foremost, of course, it's going to be the private sector and the companies that are involved. You know, we can see from what Ella has shared that there is a gap, and it's fairly persistent. I mean, honestly, the things that we're seeing in terms of what's left to go, these are not new findings in that we have always known that oleochemicals and palm oil and independent producer supply chains in soy were the difficult, thorny topics. And where we're getting to right now is effectively that we're getting diminishing returns in all the other areas because palm oil, it's mostly there in terms of food. What is left is the tricky stuff. For soy, we're not there yet for all the low-hanging fruit yet. There is more that poultry can do. There is more that eggs can do. There is more than pork can do, and seafood as well to a certain degree to close that gap. However, we're still going to have that gap. So when companies have 100% verified supply chain commitments for the end of 2025, it's not a new challenge that we have, but we really need to be making sure that we're getting on with addressing it. And for post-2025 activities, being clear about how it is that we're going to close those gaps that remain. There are a number of initiatives that already exist. We do not need to, go back to the wheel on it. Again, these are fairly common knowledge within the sector. It's just making sure that we're actioning these things, the pilot programs, everything else that's been thought of so far. We need to recognize what's going to work and what's not going to work. And in particular, the kind of theories of change that have been dominating a lot of the activity within the private sector space over the last few years around pushing for company commitments and full company action, we're starting to reach the limits of what those can achieve. And we now need to be looking at what's left. And sometimes what left is going to be, we need the legislation to actually pass in order to transform the rest of the market, because the voluntary commitments are really reaching the limits of what they can achieve on their own. Now, you, of course, will be looking at where we can look at confirming or reaffirming our commitments to 2025 with your own suppliers if you've expected. So if you're one of those companies that's expecting your supply chain to deliver on these commitments, It's important to keep that conversation live to make sure that you are holding them to account for that. And if you've never spoken to them since you set the commitment, it's probably a good time to reach out to them. For those that are quite close, and certainly on those ones in the soy side of things where there's a lot more that can be done with low-hanging fruit, you might want to consider shifting your focus to just looking at the top suppliers. As was kind of clarified, when we look across the board, if we're getting close to about 70–80% of the soy footprint that's around here of what's actually implementable from direct contracting, you're only talking about a handful of companies. It's probably 10 to 15 that are going to be on your kind of call list for how it is that you can close that out. So what are your plans with them? What are the action plans? And rather than trying to deal with that for 130, 140 companies, which is about the average that we receive when we work with businesses, focus on the small set over the coming months to make sure that you've got your plans in place. Similarly, everybody's going to start asking this question. I wouldn't be surprised if we've already got it in our Q&A here of what do we do after 2025? It's time to sort that out. And certainly with some of those downstream companies like retailers and the Retoy Soy Group that we facilitate and represent, that's a very active question that we're working through right now so that there can be greater consistency and plans for going forward. The accountability framework has their own expectations that they've put out as well, which is starting with do as much as you can within 2025 and then have short-term action plans after 2025 if you're still short on what your commitment was. But the establishment of new commitments isn't being pursued anywhere. It's more about delivery against existing commitments and how that delivery is going to take place. We would be remiss if we did not completely and clearly acknowledge that EUDR and its adoption within Europe has been transformative for the entire sector, not about the downstream sector on its own, but in the production systems. Traceability and transparency, risk management and verification is now taking place where previously it wasn't. The sector in palm and soy and cocoa and timber, they've been working on this for a while, and we're starting to see substantial changes and shifts with what's available right now. But we're also in a bit of a holding pattern, and with politics, the uncertainty is worse than a plan. Even if it's a bad plan, it's better than uncertainty. And we don't have legislation within the UK at the moment to this effect, despite 4 years of promises. If that is a concern to you, as it is to certainly many of the organizations that we work with, and the beef sector has sent a letter to the Secretary of State, the feed sector has sent a letter to the Secretary of State saying we need to be making sure that we have legislation in place. We need to make sure that we retain market access to the European Union. There is going to be a hearing in the House of Lords next week. There is a private sector letter that is being put together at the moment. And if you're interested in supporting that letter too, please let us know. You can stick it privately in a chat box to us, or you can send us an email afterwards as well, and we'll send you a copy of that letter. But we are seeing if there's wider support for that at the moment, and the retailers have been galvanizing around that position. It is nothing new in a statement because we've said literally the same thing every year for the past 4 years since the Environment Act was passed. But with murmurs and politics happening in Europe as well as in the UK, having a private sector response that acknowledges both that this is an issue that we need to be addressing efficiently and effectively as a sector, having a clear rule book is desirable. And the EUDR does provide the clarity. It's not perfect. We know that there's issues. It doesn't address conversion. There is still paperwork complexity that could be refined. Having it live and on the books and an understanding of don't come after us with full legal repercussions on day one, but expect that there's still going to be some thorny teething issues is better than it saying we don't know if it's going to happen this year or next year, because that introduces uncertainty throughout the whole supply chain. And we've heard in the confirmation about what's going to happen in 2025, some organizations have said we don't know yet because we're waiting to see if EUDR happens. And EUDR is on the statute books. It is on the statute books for going live on the 30th of December 2025. That is the state of play. If there's anything that changes upon that, that's magic 8-ball territory, and we don't tend to engage on that because we deal with the world as it is. And it's a bit cavalier to not have a response to a significant piece of legislation like that, holding out hope that it'll be delayed, because while it might be delayed again, how much, how long, and what are you doing to prepare for when it's no longer delayed and enters into force? So for policymakers, our ask is very clear: finish the job that was started some years ago. We need to make sure that legislation is enacted or expanded, that the scope of due diligence is fit for the job of eradicating deforestation and land converting the enabling environment within the EU, the UK, any other market, to make sure that information can be passed down the supply chain and evidence is available to demonstrate and effectuate due diligence practices. Of course, provide concise and scenario-based guidance so that we can have greater commonality in understanding both what the regulations require, but also about what's considered risky and what's not considered risky. So focusing on compliance requirements on really the first importers of material and not trying to introduce a huge paperwork gathering exercise for the whole value chain is important, because as Ella talked through, we are not at the state where the IT systems right now are able to provide farm level polygons to a retailer about where these commodities are coming from. Similarly, unlike the EU, which has a lovely product list that says this is what's in scope and this is what's out of scope, which is everything that's not on the list that's in scope, the UK has not taken that approach so far, which is leaving it to the market to define what's in scope and what's out of scope, and how it's all done by being particularly broad. We find that less helpful than having the clarity of saying this is what we mean when we say soy. And of course, for policymakers, please consult industry, engage with livestock producers, engage with manufacturers, retailers, service providers like ourselves, to make sure that the full market's actually represented in discussions about what's going to work. We're concerned that some conversations are happening with only a small section of the market, perhaps just the importers or other actors at the very early end of the supply chain, which maybe don't represent the willingness of downstream actors to actually engage and make sure that this is a workable system. So we can build one together, and having that input is really critical. And also for civil societies, you're part of the picture too. I think it goes without saying that getting full weight behind effective regulations is going to be what's most helpful for right now. And where there's going to be private sector actors that are vocal proponents with you, let's work together to make sure that we can have effective legislation in place that's fit for purpose and isn't onerous. It would also be helpful to have some guidelines around how progress against these commitments should be represented in public claims, including what's said around chain of custody models and the use of macro statistics. Those are all helpful reference points for businesses to have, so that it's not just various service providers or people deciding what they're going to put out there. There's heightened nervousness, particularly around green claims actions that are going against organizations. So being clear in that is particularly helpful. Similarly, traceability, certification, those being the primary kind of measures that you're using for kind of saying whether or not a company is doing well in addressing deforestation, we probably need to be moving beyond that for some of these downstream companies, because we're starting to scrape the barrel on what's achievable within that. And those complexities that Ella referred to are things that are not being undone right now. And there's work that we can try to do to address it. But the role of some of the downstream companies needs to be more reflective of what they can do in practice within their organizations through procurement or through other initiatives. And when we talk about other initiatives, be a bit vocal as what's working, so that downstream companies can focus their efforts on what's going to be most helpful to demonstrate impact. So in summary, before we open it up to the Q&A and I hand it back over to Becky, we just wanted to bring some core points. First of all, we do need action for the end of 2025, because at least with our clients, they have commitments that are going up to that. If you're a UK Soy Manifesto signatory, you also have a full company commitment against that. And for what we can see right now, we're certainly not going to be at 100%, but we could get a lot closer than where we are right now. We can, if people do what they say they're going to do, that 22% of soy should be up closer to about over 60%. And that could be vDCF by the end of 2025, if everybody does what they're going to say that they're going to be doing. Those sector-specific challenges that Ella highlighted for those kind of what we're called the lower performing product groups around that, whether it's visibility or other action, we know that needs to take place. There are working groups that are to that, but we need to make sure that efforts are accelerating the actions that are needed in order to affect change in those remaining areas. And keep in mind that despite what might be viewed as a very complex situation or challenge, It's really only a handful of suppliers within with any organization. So with our clients, your organization too, that really move the needle. And prioritizing efforts with them to make sure that we can accelerate progress is going to be the best one for addressing that first point about taking that urgent action and re-verifying or confirming those supply chain intentions. If you're new to this and it's their first time seeing it, you're of course welcome to join. One of the reasons why we established this whole process was to reduce the complexity and reporting burdens of supply chains. We know that this is a really burdensome activity in and of itself. Nobody enjoys supply chain reporting across the board. Your customers don't like asking for it. You don't like doing it. We enjoy working with you on getting it because this is where we can really get our ear to the ground as to what's happening within the value chain. But the point is about having a single harmonized process that it might be painful, but it's painful once and then it's done, as opposed to having different customers with different reporting timelines, formats, asks, interpretations, and methods. All of that's aligned. So it doesn't matter if you're down the stream or upstream. If you're interested in that simplification, of course, you can get in touch with us. Similarly, if you have any questions about what the substances that we're talking about today, what the issues are that are happening on the ground, how it is that you can address these challenges, or develop more kind of informed strategic roadmaps, or the initiatives or collaborations that you can join, we're happy to have a chat. And you can get in touch with any one of us, and we'd be pleased to introduce you to a range of things and individuals that can help affect change within your organization. Finally, 3Keel also ran a number of transparency coalitions, and we found that one of the most useful things that everybody always talked about was having that due diligence capability for their indirect supply chains and those importers. So we've changed that product to being something called Compass now, which is really about having accessible overviews of those major shippers that are being connected to your commodity supply chains, but written in ways for non-experts, but by us. So we know at least what they're saying with it when it's 5 different words that mean the same thing or slightly different things 5 different ways. And we're finding that organizations are incorporating those into their due diligence practices, because although they may not have to have the polygons from some of those importers, they would like to be a little bit beyond just saying, I received a due diligence statement reference, is that fine or not? And more broadly than that, it's staying abreast with some of the key developments in the sector and those kind of value chain actors. And our colleague Helena would be happy to tell you a bit more about that. So thank you for joining us and for having the curiosity to know what's happening within the space. If you were one of the contributing organizations, we can never thank you enough for all of the efforts that you put into responding to our follow-up questions and the evidence queries that come your way. It's immensely helpful, not just for your clients, but it enables us to be able to consolidate that knowledge and share it with a lot of the policymakers and decision makers, which are affecting your organization one way or another. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Becky, and we'll see what questions we can answer from you today.
Thanks very much, Will, and thanks very much, Ella, as well, for the presentation. It was super interesting. We have had a lot of questions through. We will try and cover as many as we possibly can within the time. I'm trying to pick some which gives a good spread of the different kind of topics people are asking questions about. Would encourage you still, please do ask your questions. Even if we can't come to it now, we can respond back to you after the session. If you ask it to non-anonymously to us, we can obviously get back to you using your email address. But I guess just one to get us started here. So one for you, Ella, thinking about sort of the retailer position in this whole thing. For those who are smaller retailers in kind of the general ecosystem, how can they approach it to make sure that their effort translates into impact? So what kind of collaboration between retailers could they potentially do for sort of influencing shared suppliers and things like that?
Yeah, thanks. I guess there's a couple of key drivers maybe that sit behind that. I think firstly, the engagement with suppliers just across the board is still beneficial. Obviously, we focus on the key suppliers today, but there is obviously a benefit of kind of wider knowledge sharing and understanding the embedded risks that sit within some of these food categories. But I think beyond that, probably playing an active role within the industry group, some of those ones that we'll refer to, obviously RSG, all of those kind of bodies and coalitions, just to ensure that there's a range of businesses and smaller retailers that have got a voice to drive some of that impact from all different angles, perhaps. I think beyond that, the consistency, as we've talked about today, of alignment of retailers and businesses asking the same things for suppliers, asking the same requirements to meet that. I think that's obviously very helpful, and we see that from a supplier perspective, I guess, to deliver mainly on that evidence collation piece. And then, yeah, I think that would probably be the main things there.
Great, thanks so much, Ella. A bit of a kind of slightly linked but a bit different question as well. So thinking around kind of encouraging disclosure, and Will, you kind of touched on this a little bit when you were talking about sort of the collective reporting processes, but you know, had somebody here saying that some of their poultry suppliers wouldn't disclose any soy information to them, as they stated that they received too many requests and will only answer members of the UK Soy Manifesto. So how can those companies try and get some more information from their supply chains in order to assess their risk?
It's a great question. I think this gets to some of the challenges of kind of those kind of persistent gaps, where in that situation you might have an organization which does actually have a program in place for delivery, but it may not actually extend to all of their value chain. We can say that, you know, we work with all of the major poultry producers as part of this reporting process, and the same with pork. And if there are ways in which that we can simplify that process for reporting so that you get what you need, but it doesn't create additional burdens for those companies, we do have what we call supplier managers. And for all the major livestock producers, it's about trying to make sure that we have that understanding, that you don't have that kind of reporting explosion to where there's lots of different things that come out. I would like to revert back to just something that Ella was referring to before around just kind of the IT system states for things, which is that there might be activity that's taking place even within one of those livestock groups, which means it actually is potentially deforestation conversion free, but they just don't have the infrastructure in place to do that reporting. We do work with a number of livestock producers where that's the case, and they send us a glorious spreadsheet. And we have to stitch it together to figure out how it all works. And we've done this for a couple of years now, and have had some refinement to make sure that we go back to that company to say, are you sure this is the way that it's going to be reported back to your customers? And part of that would be the indirect customers that aren't in their kind of core supply list with it. So I would say that you've got, in short, kind of two things. One of which is going to be, yeah, if you make the request, that's what creates the investment business case for addressing that transparency issue. But it's not always going to be the solution. And sometimes the solution might be that we look at a profile with that livestock producer and how it is that we can then share that back with you to say, look, the generic profile for that business is this, unless you've agreed something else with them for that disclosure and transparency. Of course, that's all within the realm of confidentiality for everybody, but there are problems basically that we've dealt with some livestock producers, and therefore we've got a bit of an approach and a model that could be applied for others, but it requires willingness on each side in order to have a workable exchange of information.
Great, thanks, Will. Ella, I'll put this one to you. How is the introduction of the EUDR legislation influencing existing commitments on palm oil and soy sourcing? So Will mentioned that it's changing things obviously quite a lot in the general space, but I guess what have you observed from the reporting process so far?
Yeah, good question. I guess what we're seeing over the last few years is just a lot more suppliers that are preparing for this, and a lot more awareness, a lot more kind of exposure of risk work is being done within the supply chain, and we kind of track that progress from suppliers year on year, and that has been exponentially increasing. So we're knowing that the work is happening on the ground. But I guess, yeah, we're seeing that there are multiple routes also to compliance, and that's starting to become available within the market for suppliers to prepare for EUDR when that comes in. And there are some cases, I guess, where suppliers are defaulting to verified deforestation-free rather than including conversion as well in that commitment. So deprioritizing that element of the commitment as well. And I guess in short, next year we'll have a lot more clarity on that when we've collated this year's data set, so we can kind of really see where and when this will be delivered.
Great, thanks very much, Ella. Another one for you, Will. If we're moving away from traceability and certification to address deforestation, what other measures could be better alternatives?
I'm not sure that we said we were moving away from them. It was more that we're reaching the limits of what they can achieve on their own. So if I refer back to the Accountability Framework Initiative in terms of what information is going out there and the updated guidelines that they're currently producing, and we'll see what those are when they come out. I think a key thing is saying that you don't drop the ball of saying that traceability, it's a problem and therefore it's not being addressed. And in anything, as Ella said, traceability is being addressed. What we're referring to is around downstream traceability within the market, and whether or not you need to really kind of push for addressing how it is that you deal with traceability in a non-integrated livestock production system or not, or if you try to push for traceability in terms of what's going to be happening in oleochemicals or not, or do you deal with things in some other way? So with soy, it might be that you've got a degree of perhaps certification, perhaps traceability that is being deployed and it's working and you continue to do that. That might be part of your process. But it's understanding, one, that certification does a lot more than just deforestation conversion. For soy in particular, it's a bit of a shame that it was co-opted as a deforestation-free kind of avenue, and that's what was really pushing its progress, when the reality is it does a whole other stuff with farmers. But if people are only looking at that as a deforestation kind of proof point, that's where they get significant problems now, because it's not sufficient for EUDR, it's not due diligence, and it doesn't prevent new deforestation from occurring. In which case, other initiatives like the Responsible Commodities Facility that Ella referred to earlier, and where we see some of those investments going in from currently mostly retailers, is trying to make sure that there's incentives in place for landowners so that they don't continue deforesting or converting. So it's not saying we're stopping or that companies should stop doing certification or stop doing traceability. That's absolutely not what we're saying. It's looking at making sure that the traceability is fit for purpose to a certain point. And then once you have that, and right now with many of the commodity suppliers, they're saying that they've got traceability for direct and indirect supply chains up to all of their facilities, in which case all of their purchases they're saying are verified. But that logistical corridor that gets it from their facilities to the market, that's where things are still being mass balanced around it. Do we need to push further on that when it might be outside of those company controls too? Do you want to use certification as the avenue for that? Are all some of those live questions about where we go from 2025?
Brilliant, thanks, Will. We'll just try and squeeze in one more question. We do have a lot more, but as I say, we'll try and get back to people after the session with responses to the questions we haven't had time for right now. So I guess, Will, maybe this is another one for you. Are there any plans to make the UK planned legislation in line with the EU legislation, as they're currently quite divergent?
In my plans, sure. But the issue there is that the primary legislation is the Environment Act from 2021. Under the Environment Act, it defines it as legal deforestation, and therefore it's not currently aligned. And in order to change that, you have to change the primary legislation. The consensus view, if I can call it that, is that having secondary legislation that enacts the primary legislation is the first priority, and not revisiting that primary legislation. However, again, if you're interested, we're very happy to send you the letter that you can support as your organization or business in making sure that that secondary legislation does happen and is well designed. We do try to make sure that it's promoting as much alignment with the EUDR as possible. And there's very simple things that can be done for that, such as the UK system, whatever it is, recognizing that EUDR compliant supply chains are also recognized as being deforestation-free within the UK without having any further due diligence steps that would be necessitated underneath it. We also have issues of Northern Ireland, which still, we thought that there was supposed to be a deadline on Monday of knowing who the competent authority was going to be and who was responsible for that. So hopefully we'll hear about that imminently around that, as well as just how the EUDR is going to be applying in Northern Ireland as well, and what impact the Windsor Agreement has on it. And there's lots of questions. We could have a whole webinar just on EUDR and the UK, but suffice it to say that it's not going to be a quick fix for getting alignment, but hopefully we can get as much alignment as possible. And there are certainly some low-hanging fruit that can make sure that there's recognition of what works and what doesn't work, even if the scope isn't fully aligned right now.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Will. So we're at time. I'll just hand over quickly to Ella for some closing comments.
Great, thanks, Becky. Yeah, I guess just a note to say thank you very much for attending this session, engaging with us, and lots of great questions coming through. We were really excited to share these insights with you today. They're quite a unique data set. But if you do have any questions off the back of anything we've discussed, then please do get in touch with us. And we look forward to sharing any kind of 3 key or future sessions with you. And have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.